Okay, welcome to the spring, opening of the spring lecture series. Today, the topic is a general introduction to orgonomy, not orgone therapy, but the science of orgonomy, or the general, I would think of more the natural science of orgonomy, in which we will also discuss the implications clinically. I'm beginning to feel a little bit like paparazzi, everyone has I'm going to make a big political announcement. Anyway, but so the idea that I want, the way I like to do it, in the way we've done it before, is that I will give a general presentation, sort of laying out some of the parameters of what I feel is important to know on a basic level, and then Dr. Weitzner can chime in at any time or will make comments. We were supposed to have a hookup, as we've had many times before, with Dr. Daniel Schiff from Seattle, but he wound up, his schedule got disoriented, and he's on the road, so it's impossible for him to get a hookup. I mean, probably not impossible, but beyond our technological capabilities. So, I will do a general presentation, and Dr. Eric Weitzner, who is one of the people who have trained with myself and under Dr. Victor Sobey, will make some commentary, and he usually has a refreshingly different perspective on things from me, so it won't be a kind of just Dr. Harry Lewis show. Okay? So, and then we'll really leave time for questions and answers. I find that in these kinds of settings, often the most productive thing is questioning and answering. Sometimes the questioning is more productive than the answers. So what I want to start with is, in one sense, the crucial issue which often, I would say there probably are at least two crucial issues that are often missed in the basic presentations of Reich's work. One is that the central theme in Reich's work from his earliest years, starting as early as probably 1919 in his first written work, when he was still a student, and pretty much through his whole, not pretty much, through his whole career, and possibly even before 1919, when he was not yet even involved in character analysis, psychoanalysis, and what was to become orgonomy, is a absolute central interest in the concept of energy, okay? And the concept of energetic function. And certainly, Reich goes through an odyssey, as he himself would call it, in which it takes a good 30 years or so before he realizes what energy really is, and begins to understand what this concept of energy really means in some sort of literal and material sense. But clearly, he's very, very aware in his earliest writings that to understand natural function or human function initially, you have to understand something about the nature of energy. And he makes a very interesting comment early on, as early as in the early 1920s, pointing out that Freud, who insisted that all human functioning centered on the nature of the libido, or psychosexual energy, that energy, as Freud speculated, was actually a literal and real energy, and it became very early on Reich's great mission, in a sense, or great desire, to physically isolate that energy and demonstrate its function. It was only to become a realization, a good 10 or 15 years later, once he was outside of the psychoanalytic movement, or in some ways it's what drove him outside of the psychoanalytic movement. But rather than go through in the past when I've done this, I've gone through a series of dates and when he did this and when he did that. And that's useful historically, but what I thought might be a more interesting approach today is to really focus in on these key concepts. And that energy is certainly the starting point. And I think each of these key concepts can be looked at across Reich's career, so that one doesn't have to say that first he talked about this, and then he talked about this, and then he talked about this. So rather than go to the beginning and trace his development of his ideas on energy, since I want to focus on orgonomy, let's talk about what his final presentation, his final ideas about this energy were. Certainly by the mid to late 1930s, Reich had clearly come to initially believe and then to demonstrate and prove literally and materially that this energy was unquestionably a biological material energy that functioned, a physical energy that functioned in the organism. And that the organism literally metabolized that energy. There was a metabolic process of that energy. Through a variety of experiments and investigations, he also established, which led him to the understanding that this energy was not generated solely or in some sense was not generated at all by the organism itself. In terms of investigating the metabolic processes and the energetic processes of digestion and breakdown and breathing and oxidation, that clearly he and his laboratory assistants could demonstrate that the body produced and used energy that was in excess of what energy would be produced from eating, breathing, drinking water. Right? So the question then became, if that's the case, where's this energy coming from? One thesis being, Freud's initial speculation that you're given this sort of finite energy when you're born, and the nature of life was that you use it up in discrete, discharges over the rest of your, existence until it runs out and then you die. That's what Freud's explanation of what death was, or why you die. You die because you use up all your allotted energy. Reich, I think, very early on discounted that, but as he began to investigate the material nature of this energy, which he initially pretty much assumed was very much Freud's idea that this was probably going to be a bioelectrical, biochemical process. But as he investigated it, it became fairly clear that there was some other energetic source or some other metabolic process that was going on, that organisms were charged far in excess, or significantly, I didn't say far, significantly in excess of what normal processes of biological degradation of materials and use of materials in the body would produce. So in an attempt to demonstrate what the nature of that additional energy was, led him through a number of various experiments to the discovery that there was, in fact, not a internally generated energy, but that the organism, went through metabolic processes that took energy from the atmosphere. And this led him to the discovery, finally, through a number of fortuitous accidents, actually, during his experiments, to what he initially isolated as a literal atmospheric energy. Certainly in his later work, in his final work, he began to come to the clear and decisive recognition and conclusion that this energy was not only atmospheric, but it was cosmic. And the use of that term often confuses people because in his later work there's some tendency for people to interpret Reich's final work on the nature of cosmic orgone energy, what he calls orgone energy, this cosmic energy is somehow a more mystical kind of cosmic creation. But Reich is very, very literal in his investigations of this. And clearly he begins to come to the conclusion that there is this pervasive energy which probably was earlier on referred to in the history of development of physics and astrophysics as the ether. And there's been a lot written by people interested in this, demonstrating that Reich, in one sense, is clearly demonstrating the literal material nature of what was often speculated on as the ether. And interestingly, in terms of contemporary astrophysics and astronomy, much of the new discoveries, that the universe is not, a vacuum, and that there is a huge amount of material there, and that there are these clouds of particles that are not quite energy and not quite matter. Clearly, Reich had begun to tap into that and see quite in advance of final, data, new data, what was really, a process, I think, that will turn out to be pretty accurate in some way. From our point of view, without going, I just want to sort of lay out the kinds, the breadth of Reich's investigation. But more centrally, for Reich, energy then becomes the centerpiece for the science that he calls orgonomy. This energy, which I'm now discussing, Reich finally gives the name orgone energy. The historical reason what the name really had to do with, more related to the concept of organic function rather than orgasm. A lot of people assume that orgone energy or orgonomy means sex energy. It's not sexual energy or biological energy. The origin of the term had much more to do with the concept of organic energy, of an organic functioning energy, which drove the organism. Reich liked to make up words or make up names. Right? It was a very Germanic kind of wordplay that that he was always very interested in and appealed to him. So, in Reich's terms, once he could identify this energy, and once he did, by the late 30s, isolate this energy in a demonstrable way, and that became crucial. In other words, to speculate about energy is nothing new. What Reich does, which I think is distinctively important, is he actually seeks out, identifies this energy, materializes it, demonstrates its existence physically. And one of the interesting things, which is constantly difficult in this work, is that there are ways of showing orgone energy and demonstrating it, and it's not a question of believing in energy. Unlike more New Age and other more mystical systems, or even Eastern systems, which are not necessarily mystical, but basically accept the existence of energy as a, sort of a given. Orgonomy, or Reich's work, is quite unique in that he works very diligently. He and his students work very to demonstrate the physical, and this is very Western, the physical existence of this energy, and the material existence of it, and ways of collecting it, demonstrating it, and presenting it, and using it. And so in that process, and I'm not going to go into exact details of exactly how you do that. That's another kind of presentation. If we had the wherewithal, we've done it a couple of times where we've actually set up microscopes and some demonstration projects. But that aside, there are specific ways, the most dramatic being the use of a vacuum tube, in which there's a picture of it in supercosmic imposition, where you can actually get a tube to glow blue and visibly irradiate the energy, and you can intensify it in a if you go into the kind of room that Reich designed up at Orgonomy, which is a large accumulator room that intensifies the charge in the room. So that there are clear ways of demonstrating that energy, visibly showing it. There's the simple way on the next very clear, crystal clear day that many of you probably know if you've read Reich, of going out. Many of you have known, even without reading Reich, because you've done it. Kids do it. I can remember doing it when I was a kid. You look up at a clear sky and you keep your eyes open and you begin to see movement in the sky. And first you think, well, it must be something, in my eyes or something internal. But if you really adjust for that, you realize that you're actually seeing, and other people will see it too if they look, specific movement in the sky. And clearly that's a physical demonstration of something going on, external from the body existing in there. There might be, mechanical ways of explaining it, but in fact, all the mechanical explanations don't account for the fact that there is this phenomenon. So there are a variety of demonstrations. More dramatically, of course, as Reich begins to do his work, he experiments with the idea that if this energy exists, how might it affect the living organism? All sorts of living organisms, whether they're small, one-celled organisms or complex, multicellular organisms, including human beings. In pursuit of that, he begins to experiment, as any scientist would, with devices that increase the amount of energy. And this leads into development of things that we now call accumulator devices, which were designed to build a charge that could be used and manipulated in some way to both work with individual human organisms, but to work with the environment, or to adjust the environment. So that throughout his work, the issue is energy, okay, and the nature of this energy. And the demonstration of this energy physically has a crucial impact in the way his work goes. In one sense, there are certain historical reasons for why Reich breaks with psychoanalysis or with traditional psychology, but probably central to it developmentally is that once Reich postulates the existence of a literal material physical energy, he's making a departure away from philosophy, from speculation, and from belief. Okay? And more than that, he is moving into an area of that demands scientific investigation. Once he postulates that, the question then is, does it actually exist, or doesn't it actually exist? Freud had the luxury of speculating, so he could say, well, it's probably this, but if that doesn't fit, I can move over here. I feel there was a range of slip, movement that he could allow, which allowed in many ways, when one reads extensively in psychoanalytic literature, particularly in Freud's writings, he shifts around a lot. If he gets sort of uncomfortable with where a particular idea or position leads, he can often adjust it quite quickly, because he's basically working within in reality, within a philosophical system. Freud himself basically felt that he was largely, while he was a scientist, he was also primarily involved in sort of a mega scientific project and involved in a philosophical sort of engagement. But for Reich, once he takes that step and says this is a literal energy, then it is incumbent upon him as a scientist to demonstrate the nature of that energy, to prove or disprove, really, to negate the existence of that energy. And in the process of doing that, he literally discovers that energy and demonstrates it. That discovery and that demonstration is fact. Whether people accept it or not has nothing to do with the fact that it's demonstratable, it's presentable, it's literal. Once he has that literal energy isolated, and once he begins to explore the nature of that energy and its characteristics, he then is really in another realm. As he said, it's beyond psychology. The hardest thing that I think almost all of us have to deal with when we deal with orgonomy, myself included, everyone I know, is it is not psychological. It's not about psychology. I mean, there are psychological implications for anything that we experience physically and organically, but that the primary interest in Reich, and as Reich got further into this work, he had less and less interest in psychology. And if you're listening to Reich, if you come to the next lecture, which will involve excerpts of spoken work of Reich and from lectures on these CDs that were released about a year or so ago. One of the things that's very interesting, you hear Reich get constantly frustrated, and he'll constantly saying, no, you're going to psychology, you're psychologizing, you're psychologizing. It's very, very hard to keep people, patients, students, focused on the fact that this is really, once Reich moves into the study of energy and the nature of this energy, he is no longer really in the realm of psychology. He's talking about natural energetic functions and their implications in all matter, living and non-living. And in that sense, I've also always felt, as I've gotten into this, that one of the reasons that more and more people reject Reich, or in all sorts of areas, is because he really moves into a realm that's not particularly useful to a lot of different factions, whether it's not useful to the world of physics, modern astronomy. It's not particularly useful to psychology because, in a sense, if you follow Reich's premises, you abandon traditional psychology. And interesting, Reich was never negative about psychology. I mean, don't forget, among his most famous statements were that you can do a lot of the same things that you can do orgonomically through psychology. It just takes longer, and it's just more arduous, and there's more reasons for getting confused and disorganized. So again, energy becomes the central operating core of orgonomic thinking, what Reich will come to call orgonomic functionalism, orgonomic science. Okay? So with that, it then seems to me that you have to consider what Reich talks about when he talks about the nature of this energy. So in one sense, to understand what we mean by orgonomy and what orgonomy is proposing, you have to understand that there is, at its core, energetic function. The second thing is to understand what Reich means by the nature of energetic function. Energetic function, in some, in the simplest fundamental sense, based on Reich's investigations, really involves a very, very simple reality that energy is pulsation, or expresses itself, that this energy expresses itself in a pulsatory manner. And that the key to the nature of this energetic function, which gets more and more supported by recent astronomical investigations and data that's coming in as they try to get a unified theory of the universe, is that there is this process of expansion and contraction, which is pulsation. I mean, many of you have heard my lectures before and heard me, expand. It can easily become sort of mechanical, just expansion and contraction. But this energy essentially operates throughout nature of all, not just living matter, but in all nature. And in fact, in Reich's terms, certainly towards the end of his work, the line between life and the living and the non-living is less and less significant. It's really one continuous nature, one continuous universe in which the energy gets expressed in different ways with different with different conditions. So that it is in a very fundamental sense a unified theory of the universe, which also, since it's not a religion, it's also not very useful to most people. Okay, the standard line I always get, people who are more interested in religion will ask me what my beliefs are, or what people would ask Reich what his beliefs are. He said, I don't believe in anything. I just look at it. This is nature. This is how it works. And the meaning of it is that that's it. It is, okay, for what it is. So what is this pulsation? Expansion and contraction are exactly that, essentially. And and again, Reich was a very, very well-trained 19th century physicist. He was in his basic understanding of physics was Newtonian and Einstein, and then late 19th century, early 20th century Einsteinian, with some arguments with Einstein, but nonetheless, Reich's ideas were essentially that the expansion and contraction were roughly, expressions of the energetic movement, and essentially that expansion was equal to contraction. That in a normal pulsatory system, the expansion and contraction were fairly equal, fairly in a sense, infinite and non-deteriorative, although there were conditions for possible deterioration. What the implications most people begin to look at, few of us are interested in the broader implications of Reich's energetic theories, but most people, of course, then come to look at the issue of this energetic function in terms of how it applies to the world that we live in. And certainly a broad area of Reich's work, and possibly the largest piece of Reich's work, because in a sense, I've jumped ahead, his interest in cosmic orgone energy, or cosmic energy, or cosmic processes, or broad universal processes, really is a late, end period of his life. There have been speculations as to why he went there and had to do more with, some people feel that he was becoming more and more isolated, more and more desperate, and was looking for more mystical, answers. But in fact, if you read his later works, they're not any less, scientifically driven than his early ones. But I think that there was clearly a desire to understand the full continuum. But by far the largest part of Reich's building of orgonomy as a science was focused in on two areas, basically natural science and social science, or what I would like to call the sciences of combine the sciences of nature, or as Reich liked to term, the investigation of our roots in nature. And that's a very interesting phrase. There's a T-shirt that has that on it too. But it's a great phrase because I think what Reich really was interested in is, and says many times, is that we as human organisms, as human beings, are really only one variation on the expression of energy in nature. We're not, we're unique, but no more unique than a paramecium or an amoeba is unique. And that our arrogance and our assumptions about our, specialness as opposed to any other organism's specialness is probably what leads to great conflict and problems in our world, in the simplest sense. But certainly, for Reich, the idea of understanding our roots in nature also leads to understanding how this energy expresses itself in our organisms. Okay? And certainly, a key to understanding orgonomic theory, orgonomic science, is to understand that the same pulsatory processes that Reich can talk about later on that exist universally or exist cosmically, exist in our organism. So that when we're born as pulsatory systems, as pulsatory organisms. We're designed, or we exist as processes in which expansion and contraction are continuous and self-regulating. So that when we're born, those processes of expansion and contraction, at least in theory, are not interfered with, are self-motivating and self-regulated. They simply exist in much the same way that any pulsatory process would exist in nature, okay? With some different manifestations because of the way it's organized in our system. So that it will look different in an amoeba, if you look at amoeba, but then essentially the process is the same in a multicellular organism like ourselves. Reich always used to like to say that really human beings are not really that much different when you really come down to it than amoebas, that really your arms are pseudopedia and your legs are pseudopedia and the rest of it's just, it's all protoplasm anyways. Okay? So central to that is if you begin to then understand that when we look at the clinical implications for this, or at least the understanding of the nature of human functioning on all sorts of levels, the issue of the development of children from birth, actually from conception to birth, through into adulthood and then into decline. If you follow that thread, then in one sense you can begin to say that anything that we become is inevitably an expression of how that energetic pulsatory function becomes either facilitated, encouraged, or interfered with, discouraged, or blocked. These begin to get into terms that become somewhat familiar to many of us. That interference with this pulsatory process in one way or another will produce specific outcomes. and Reich would say, we don't know whether those outcomes will be good or bad. They simply will produce it's again, his favorite analogy would be the idea of a stream. You block a stream, it's going to produce a variety of expressions in terms of where that flow is going to go. And you can't predict necessarily, you can try to predict, but you can't always control which way the water is going to deflect and run, and what the results of that blocking of the stream is going to be. In some cases it can be quite beneficial, in other cases it can be quite disastrous. But what you do know that is inevitable is that if you block it or interfere with it in some way or change it in some way, it will produce changes all the way through the system. So that clearly as individual systems, energetic systems, come into the environment of other energetic systems, how this becomes organized socially in our social systems, through our family systems, which are the representatives of social systems, Reich being the first to point that out, one of the first to point that out, and its implications. This energetic pulsatory, this free energetic pulsatory function begins to become organized. And how that becomes expressed over a long period of time will lead to how you or I become you or I, and how we become a self. Okay? And in one fundamental sense, again, orgonomy approaches the situation, if we work in a clear orgonomic context, approaches it in a fundamentally different context than most other treatment models or clinical models. We approach it with the idea that if you're having a problem, the problem really is not that your mother was not nice to you. That might be the origin of it, or that your mother mistreated you, or that your father was killed in the war, and on and on, okay? And you've longed for him in some way. That those might be the historical events that produced the situation, but that the real problem is that whatever those events were, right, they produced an alteration or an interference with your natural pulsatory energetic function. And once that takes place, it gets translated into not only emotional states, but into physical expression in the organism. It limits, it directs, it reorganizes the overall system on all levels. So if I had a board here, that we've done before, many of you know already, my schema of the fact that you always have the physical, which gets organized socially and culturally, that produces the internal interpersonal experience of the self, okay, what we might call psychology. So that in a very real way, there are many anecdotes, which again will probably come out more in the next follow-up lecture in May, but what Reich himself talks about, that when you begin to look at the history of why someone develops a particular problem in their life, it's easy to get lost in that, and certainly for the individual, for any of us, we get lost in that because it's our lives. We're trying to understand it and come to terms with it. But in reality, from an orgonomic perspective, from the perspective of a clinician working in this model, or someone thinking in these terms, and by clinician, ideally, in Reich's terms, he was hoping that clinicians would not be psychologists or psychiatrists or treating psychiatric disorders, that eventually they would be what he called an orgonomic medicine, in which you were treating any kind of alteration, any kind of dysfunction in the organism, including the full range from emotional to physical. But any alteration or interference with the natural pulsatory function would produce some adjustment in that organism, and that would, if it became chronic, that would become part of the organism's characteristic, presentation in its environment, in its life, and the individual would experience that as who they are and what they become. If it's severe enough, it will produce a varieties of dysfunction. both physically and emotionally and behaviorally, socially. So that, but at heart, what always, as orgonomists, if we work orgonomically, what we always have to focus on is that what is at the center of this is that there has been an alteration and an interference with natural energetic function. So it's not, again, it's not that the mother didn't breastfeed. It's that when the mother didn't breastfeed, the organism, the child, and here's where in my work I've used extensively and begun to incorporate broad levels of the work of John Bowlby and Daniel Stern and Mary Ainsworth in terms of attachment psychology. When the mother doesn't breastfeed for whatever reason, right, it's not that the lack of breastfeeding produces the problem. I mean, certainly that's the trigger, but what happens is that the newborn organism adjusts and responds to that. And in that adjustment and response, depending on the circumstance, is the beginning of what Reich will later call, in his early works rather, will call the building of characterological patterns, the setting of characterological patterns, and building of character armor if it goes on long enough. And along with that, the expression of the physical organization of the organism in order to tolerate those adjustments. So that what Reich comes to call armoring really is an attempt on the part of the organism to tolerate adjustments in its natural biological pulsatory function. So that, again, this also helps explain why insight, and Reich points this out in his book Beyond Psychology, in the book that's edited called Beyond Psychology, and a lot of his writings there, that the problem with traditional talk therapies is that you can go over and over and over what your mother did to you, or what happened when your father left home, or when your father beat you. All of these things are not to be discounted and are certainly real, but none of them really address what happened to you when that went on, in terms of what kinds of adjustments your organism made on a simple, basic, functional level when those things happen and when they happen repeatedly. Reich will then go, and again, this is another thing that makes Reich's work sometimes very uncomfortable for psychologists or contemporary more complex thinkers. He always goes back to simple analogies, simple explanations. It's the same thing, Reich says, as what happens to a plant when it's growing, or a tree. So that if you have a plant that grows in a healthy, nutrient environment with everything available to it, it's going to grow totally consistent with its potential, physical nature. It's going to expand and contract and grow and grow as strong and healthy as possible. If there's interference with that for any number of reasons, it could be interference because we decided to do an experiment, and interfere with it. But whatever the reason, or it can be out in the woods and another tree falls on it, doesn't kill it, but prevents it from growing this way, so it grows this way. Or some lightning hits it and it splits it, and so then but it doesn't die. If it doesn't die, it grows in response to that. Or the seed lands in a inhospitable environment, but not inhospitable enough for it not to grow, but so inhospitable that it grows in a very, very limited, truncated, or more problematic way. Whatever the circumstances, the organism, as long as it is not completely destroyed, will continue to attempt to express its natural energetic core. And in doing that, it will do the best it can. So that for many of you, when we hear the expression that, look, somebody did the best they could, or you're doing the best they can, that's what that means. You're doing the best you can given what you're presented with. And in that process, at the core of that is always the relentless expression, or the inevitable expression, of pulsation, of expansion and contraction, and the metabolic processes of energy, of that energy, until that energy is no longer contained in our system, at which point is one way of thinking about death, is that the energy goes someplace else, wherever that is. You want to call it heaven, you want to call it hell, you want to call it, just the sea of energetic, universe, whatever it is. But as long as we're contained in our system, we will continue to struggle to express that energy as best we can. So I think central to that is certainly what Reich is always coming back to. And if you can keep that as central, certainly in doing treatment, to the extent that we'll talk to some extent, I'm not opposed to talking about, in doing orgone therapy, which fewer and fewer of us do, but to the extent that one does orgone therapy, that to do orgone therapy is to keep absolutely focused on that goal, which is to increase the possibility and the potential for a given organism to do the best it can in expressing and maintaining its energetic function. So what does that mean? That means that some organisms are so damaged that they're not going to grow to be tall, redwoods. They might remain stunted, growth, but that doesn't mean that you're not continuously trying to enhance the possibilities of that organism experiencing more within its given limitations. Now, Reich himself tended to lose interest in long-term treatment because he just didn't have the time or energy. But certainly for those of us who continue to treat and to work with people who are in some way impaired in terms of their energetic function, that it's incumbent upon us, if we're doing this kind of work, to keep in mind that our goal is to increase the potential of the organism to tolerate more and more energetic function, to tolerate not only the expansions but the contractions, okay? Which then leads me to, and I'll finish up on, the one thing which is often dropped out of discussions in orgonomy these days, and to the extent that anybody talks much about orgonomy these days, that the single central reality of the way human organisms, certainly, and probably most animal organisms, most living organisms, but perceptually, the single most central issue in terms of the expression of this energy in humans is sexual function. And it's very fascinating to talk to or read or encounter individuals who were interested in Reich's work, particularly giving lectures on Reich's work and Reichian therapies or Reichian approaches or various groups, mystical groups that, New Age groups that include or incorporate much of Reich, that much of what is taken by Reich is often desexualized. That essentially the central core of human function for Reich is always the expression of that pulsation, which in the human organism is always sexual. That the nature of the human organism is as a sexual being. That the expression of our energetic pulsatory function is sexual. If you understand it that way, and I always like to point out to my students on all levels, Reich is not interested in sex. I mean, personally he was, but I mean, as we all are. But when he talks about sexual function, he is not talking about whether you can get an erection, whether you can, have sex, whether you can perform sex this way, that way, here. I mean, he's interested in that as a human, to the extent that he's interested in human behavioral history or function. But what he's talking about is how impaired or how capable you are of your organism is, you as an organism are for expressing that natural pulsatory function in a way that maximizes your overall healthy metabolism of energy in your system. So that an individual who cannot do that chronically for extended periods of time is obviously going to have to make serious and often disturbing adjustments, which a huge part of our society, most of our societies do, okay? And Reich is extremely valuable to us if we read him in mass psychology, fascism, or in the sexual revolution, or any number of other works on the subject, is astoundingly, valuable in pointing out what kind of massive adjustments and massive catastrophes can result from these kinds of severe alterations in the natural function of multiple organisms, human organisms, or in the alteration of any organisms in nature. Don't forget that Reich was one of the first to really point out, even before Rachel Carson, the existence and the implications of what we would now call pollution. And he didn't use those terms, but clearly when you read Reich on the nature of ecological breakdown in the environment, his research, his studies, clearly he was beginning to see what Rachel Carson would later call, pollution, and study in terms of the ecological breakdown of the environment. So again, but for Reich, the interesting thing was not, while he was concerned about the impact environmentally on the whole planet, what he was interested in is the central theme, again, how that this all was about alterations in the nature of an expression of natural energetic function, whether it's in a plant, or whether it's in water, or whether it's in rocks, or whether it's in the stars, or whether it's in the amoeba, or whether it's in the human organism. So when we do treatment, again, the goal for anyone doing orgonomy is always to increase the organism's potential for fuller and fuller expression of pulsatory capacity, therefore meaning a greater capacity for sexual engagement, the sexual embrace. That doesn't mean that it has to be, you have to have, part of the problem always in orgonomy is the assumption, it was the misconception that what Reich was saying, well, you got to have your morning dose of sex in order to be healthy, or that you have to have an active sexual, regimen in order to be healthy. Actually, Reich would shiver at such thoughts because basically that becomes mechanical. As Reich would say, only an armored organism would think that way. Right? And that's always the problem. That goes back to, and again, to finish up, goes back to Reich's first paper that he delivered in front of the psychoanalytic community in, I think, 1919, a little later, 1921, on masturbation, and the entire group around Freud himself said it was brilliant, but a number of the older guys came by and said, but did you have to use the word sexuality so much? And sex, so much reference to sex. And these are these Austrian, psychoanalysts. And Freud himself always felt that Reich talked too much about sex. He used the word too much. And this is coming from Freud. So again, though, but there again, it's that only the organism that is tortured by its inability to have a natural, healthy metabolism of its energetic function through sexual expression, through the expression of its organism, would be so charged. Reich, and we'll finish up, Reich's final statement was that in a healthy organism, of course, the Reich's detractors always used to love, and still to the extent that they concern themselves, love to use this. It was Reich would say that a good, healthy sexual life, sex life in an organism would be the equivalent of the same way that someone drinks, it would be like getting a good glass of cold water when you're thirsty. And they say, oh, they're trivializing sex, making it like all it is getting a glass of water. And Reich said at one point, he said, remember Dr. Sophie saying, he said, no, he said, when you're really thirsty, there's nothing like a good glass of water. It's wonderful, But again, we usually are not comfortable with that. So that the general concept of what sexuality is for us means how much you screw, how much you do this. And for most people, active sexual life means somehow aping the antics of various pornographic or erotic, adventures, rather than simply the rather mundane reality of the fact that it's not much different than the way an amoeba expands and contracts and looks for food in its environment. So not that it doesn't have meaning to us or significance or feeling, but that the significance and feeling will take care of itself. I tell patients certainly all the time that the healthier you get, you need less and less information about how to be with somebody or what to be with when you're with somebody and when not to be with somebody when it doesn't, you know. The single, last anecdotal thing, the single hardest thing, for instance, in humans, organisms, male and female, is to get people not to have sex when they don't want to. Right? Not to be sexual if they don't feel it. You know, it's you know, again, in a healthy organism, one responds when one has the need. So in other words, it's as foolish to have a sexual encounter if you don't feel the impulse because you feel you should perform, as it is to drink a lot of water when you're not thirsty, because you're just going to get bloated. Right? And in a sense, individuals who are hypersexual, when certainly we live in a society that encourages hypersexuality, tend to get bloated. And it often produces all sorts of potential deleterious effects, as opposed to individuals who are so afraid of any movement that they can't engage in any way. So again, very, very much to end my overall general presentation is to keep in mind that throughout what I've just presented is the central core is energetic function, expansion and contraction and its implications. And one can read almost all of Reich's work and one can approach the nature of orgonomic science, orgonomy, as a study of the nature and function of energy universally. If one reads Reich carefully, almost each book is an attempt at some level to understand the implications of what I just laid out. So, I mean, you can respond, comment, go your own way. Or
I don't think I'll go my own way. I mean, you gave us a wonderful overview of Reich's work, and I'm not sure which part of it to comment on, but let me introduce a couple of maybe provocative ideas. Reich, starting with the theoretical part, having to do with energy and function, as you were talking, I had I was having a certain feeling which reminded me of a phrase which Reich used to use in some of his writings. He talked about the too muchness of orgonomy. That one of the problems we have with orgonomy as a theory and a method of investigation and understanding and treatment and all that is that it's so all-inclusive. When you encounter Reich's ideas, there seems to be too much contained in them. They seem to include everything. And I think they're probably I mean, this is pure speculation, but I always had the sense in reading his later writings that he had a feeling that he was coming to the end of his life. Right. And he needed to make large leaps in his conceptualizations in order to develop a theory which was all-inclusive. And I think he wrote somewhere that he had actually only created a scaffolding.
Yes, actually, in the Cancer Biopathy, in the introduction to Cancer Biopathy, he talks about the fact that one is he only created scaffolding, and he apologized for how rushed it was.
Right, he felt rushed.
Right, yeah.
So he wanted to create the scaffolding, which was potentially all-inclusive, so that his key ideas of functionalism and pulsation and so forth, that these could be applied in a way which could conceivably take into account just about any phenomenon which man had thought about. But some people would call that reductionism.
Some people do.
Right. So one of my the things that I would throw out is as a question is how do we distinguish reductionism from legitimate all-inclusive theorizing. One thing you didn't mention was the concept of functional identity and antithesis. And that's very important in addressing the idea of psychology, for example, that Reich had formulated as part of his functional thinking, the idea you could have phenomena in different realms of experience, or fundamentally different, qualitatively different kinds of phenomena, but they could be in some way identical because they were expressions of the same energy and the same kind of function. So that you could have character armor as a psychological phenomenon and muscular armor as a biophysical phenomenon.
Or expansion and contraction as expressions of
right.
the same.
Energy movement, but in different directions.
Right.
So I think that there is a way of approaching psychology. I think Reich's distaste for psychology had to do with what his agenda was. It wasn't that he didn't think it was important,
no.
but he didn't have any time for it.
No, I think
but there is a functional identity
Absolutely.
between many of the
Absolutely.
ergonomic functions and certain psychological functions, like what we call in psychoanalysis, for example, defense.
I think that's a very, very important point. Stop it. Reich, and also I think Reich was not against psychology, and was not, when he says he'd gone beyond psychology, was that he did not, and when you read Reich, he is not anti-psychology, he's not negative about psychology, it's simply that he has gone beyond that, and in a sense, when you read Reich carefully, he includes psychology. It's very, very it's clearly included. But he's less interested, though, in the specifics of how you do psychoanalysis. So anecdotally, if I can, is actually we at a seminar with Dr. Zoe, we listened to a tape in which a couple of the doctors wanted to know from Reich if what the character structure. They started talking about character structure at a seminar, and Reich said that's psychology, and they said, well, but what's he said, you don't think I know what character structure is? He said, I wrote the book on it. This is you want to know what and he laid it all out. He said, but that's not what we're interested in here. And he said, it's useful, but it's not. So I think, but clearly, psychology is an expression of all this.
Another thing I wanted to highlight, which I think is very interesting, especially for those of us who are still interested in Freud and what his theory means and how it differs from Reich's theory. One of the key concepts in Freud's theory is the unconscious. In fact, that you could argue that that's the foundation of psychoanalysis, is the discovery of the unconscious, just like for Reich, it's the discovery of the orgasm function, we could argue. For Freud, the idea of the unconscious is not just a biological idea. That Freud had this idea that the unconscious was something which is part of our inheritance, both biological and psychological and historical. For Reich, the unconscious was, if I'm not mistaken, what he called the middle layer. Mm-hmm. That he thought that what Freud had found in the unconscious was a result of the armoring of the organism. And this is a very, very big fundamental theoretical and philosophical difference between the two men and between the two theories. And I think it's worth thinking about, because Reich was a revolutionary and Freud was a conservative. Freud accepted the fact that the unconscious was part of our inheritance, that all of us were in some way destined to go through the painful dramas of life, having to do with falling in love and disappointment in love and loss of the beloved object, and the Oedipus complex, was a variation on that. And because of his conservatism, he used different data in forming his theory. He used archaeology and anthropology, whereas Reich used sociology, Marxist sociology, as part of his data. But Freud used what already existed in Western culture as part of the data of his theory, and which led to a very, very conservative theory that all of us were of necessity miserable. and our instincts could not really express themselves. I mean, this became even worse in Anna Freud, who made it into a kind of a caricature of some kind of impossibility of expressing sexual feelings as a child or an adolescent without being traumatized. But I mean, that was not Freud's idea, and I don't know if he knew about that in his daughter. I'm not sure he would have approved of it. But it led to this very pessimistic idea about treatment. And if you read Freud's final and most profound statement about treatment, it's very pessimistic. In that monograph he wrote, Analysis Terminable and Interminable, where he expresses a deep pessimism about the limits and prospects of psychoanalytic treatment. So I think this is one of the great things that Reich gave us, is an alternative to Freud's pessimism. But then the question comes up of why is it that I think Freud and Reich in the end may have not been that far apart, because Reich also came to realize how difficult it was to remove armor, how difficult it was to reestablish pulsation in an organism which had grown up inhibited and constrained. And using the metaphor of the tree or the plant, which hasn't been able to grow straight, Reich developed his own sort of pessimism about how difficult it was to achieve therapeutic results to the extent that we would like to achieve them. And we know all too well that at the end of his life, as he was trying to develop his energetic theories in order to encompass all of the clinical phenomena that he saw, that he developed what I think could be called a dualism, having to do with two different types of energy, one which is a pro-life energy and one which is anti-life. Now, Freud in 1920 had come up with the idea of the death instinct, which was a dualism which Reich at the time rejected very energetically, went to Freud, so he tells us, to argue against the idea of a death instinct as unnecessary. And he tells us that Freud said, well, you're right, we don't need to postulate a death instinct, but this is where my observations have led. It may not be correct, you may be correct. But the reason that Freud had postulated the death instinct is because of certain clinical phenomena, the unconscious guilt, repetition compulsions, in other words, masochistic, self-defeating kinds of behavior, which made it very, very difficult for him to treat certain patients successfully. And I think it's very interesting that Reich, having gone in a completely different direction, initially much more life-affirmative and optimistic and radical, also encountered in his own way the difficulties of human nature and of trying to change the organism and trying to open it up, trying to change society, trying to make societies less rigid and more open to life affirmative. So I think that is a very, very important question for us, because we can't get away from it. There wouldn't be so many of us who have needed therapy if there were not something in human nature which makes armoring so easy for us. I mean, Reich approaches that question I believe in cosmic superimposition, where he talks about the nature of consciousness and self-consciousness, and trying to understand energetically and functionally what consciousness is. And he has an intuition, which is difficult, I think, to explain, but I think probably comes from some deep awareness in himself and in his patients of the way in which the human being expresses the energy as opposed to other energetic manifestations around us, that there is something about self-consciousness which makes it very painful for us to experience certain kinds of emotions and certain kinds of energy movement and certain kinds of maybe energy contractions. And so that the contractions tend to become persistent and chronic and lead to armoring. And this is one of the clinical difficulties and theoretical difficulties that we face, I think, when we confront Reich's work. So I'll stop there, because I know I've said a lot of...
No.
There's a lot of provocative...
Well, a couple of just amendments to that. One is, Reich himself actually wrote about, at the end of his life, wrote actually on the issue of the death instinct. And on the event of Freud's death in 1939, he wrote a little piece saying that in revisiting the death instinct controversy, I mean, what Dr. Weitzman is referring to, of course, was a major split. I mean, one of the things, among other things, there are other historical reasons, but one of the big, really dividing points for Reich and the Freudian group had much to do with the issue of the death instinct and the implications in terms of masochism and masochistic type. Reich remained adamant that there was no biological evidence for an instinctual death instinct or thanatos, and was adamant about the fact that Freud himself had said he agreed, but then for political reasons, allowed it to move and become more central. But at the end, Reich clearly felt that that he was wrong, and that Freud at some level had, for the wrong reasons or from a misdirected observation, touched on the fact that the nature of what Reich called the impact of deadly orgone energy, but in fact, in terms of what we're talking about, the impact of the persistent long-term restriction of the organism produces in that organism a sort of self-defeating or self-limiting process that in Reich, always in his most inimitable way, comes to say is that, well, Freud touched on it. He always admired how close Freud was, but that what he missed was the basic mechanism for it. And I think what's interesting to me always in Reich is that what Reich sees is the mechanism is not that individuals are born with a death instinct, but that because of the nature of pulsation and the limitation of pulsation that our social environment or our environment imposes, that it's inevitable that individuals will become energetically stuck or energetically restricted and therefore begin to respond. And on these tapes that you'll hear when we do excerpts, Reich points out that the initial response to that restriction is not irrational, it's rational. To begin to armor, to begin to pull back, to begin to resist that kind of restriction is quite rational. The organism is not doing anything pathological, it's responding as it must. So I think Reich really was sensitive to that. Unlike Freud, I mean, I think Reich did, as he got, I agree with Dr. Weitzner, become increasingly pessimistic about the hope of really being able to change it. But in typical fashion, almost until the very end, or maybe until the very end, Reich's reaction was very different, given his structure, than Freud's. Freud's reaction was gradually to become more and more isolated, more and more unhappy, or more and more sense of grand tragic defeat in one sense, or failure. Reich's response, he would go through these periods of defeat and failure and come back with some, well, maybe we can do it this way. It was always a sense of, let's push through, let's try to get it moving again. Let's stir it up. And to the very end, Reich's response to this idea of the fact that you were getting these kinds of profound limitations or death instinct kind of, was that maybe the answer was not psychology, not therapy and such, but a device or a method for stirring it up, breaking it up, moving it around so that it doesn't become increasingly dead. And when all else failed, I think at the very end, it does become more and more cosmic, so that finally the last, and some people might say delusion, but the last hope is that maybe this is all just part of a cosmic pattern that can be blown apart and opened up and restructured so that the energy will move more freely and life will be reasserted. So I think there's this constant desire for expand, to create to stir it up, to open it up, to if anything, I mean, that often got him into great trouble. Certainly, by the last writings, the belief that a spaceship was going to come and reorganize. I mean, don't forget Reich's favorite fantasy, was his favorite movie was The Day the Earth Stood Still, which he felt very clear. Does everyone know that film? It's a wonderful film. It's actually, it's a beautiful, beautiful movie. And Reich really felt that in some ways he identified so strongly with the fact that he had this kind of knowledge and message that would open, solve so many of these problems, but that the world was not, people were so restricted, so limited that they could never really embrace it, that they would destroy it. And I think until the very end, there really was this sense of optimism. And I think that's the difference, is that Freud was inherently pessimistic, going back to his earliest writings. I mean, even when he was optimistic, it was a certain kind of heaviness about, it was real dramatic kind of. Whereas Reich, from his earliest writings, is extremely because of the radical, is very optimistic. So even when he's defeated, even when he comes into the most profound, depressed periods of his life, he always rallies with a kind of optimistic, let's push forward, And so I think there are these profound, and Reich had a sense of humor about this. I mean, I think, because there's the anecdote that he tells, Dr. Sobey went up to visit him when he had spent one of the winters up in Orgonomy, and he said, he asked Dr. Reich how he was doing. He said it was okay. He said that it was sort of very quiet there, and that was nice. But he said sometimes he'd lay around the fire at night, looking at the fire, and he'd think that, well, maybe we're all just a bunch of fleas on the back of a bear walking through the woods, and all this is just an illusion. And then he looked at Dr. Sobey and said, Dr. Sobey, please don't go back to New York and tell anybody this. They already think I'm psychotic, and this will prove to them that I am. So he understood. And if you read Contact with Space, his last, finished work, there's a lot of stuff that can easily be read as delusional, as losing it. But underneath it, there is always this sense of this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm feeling, this is thoughts I'm having, and probably, as many of Reich's associates, close associates, Bill Steig and others, would tell him, don't publish those things because people will just use it. And to some extent, that's the case. But also, I think very important here is that in keeping with this, I think Dr. Weitzman is hitting on something, on the issue of the unconscious, or Reich's view of what the unconscious was, or Reich's reconstruction of that, in saying that Freud conceives of the unconscious as central, Reich sees the unconscious as a secondary layer. The key issue, and Reich addresses it, but probably what I found to be most useful in the work of John Bowlby was that Reich talks about the fact that what Freud called the unconscious was really, in some ways, expressions of the interference with the biological function of the organism in the creation of what he calls the secondary layer, which is the layer of what Freud would probably call the superego, in the sense of the rules, the outside, the interdicts from society. Producing alterations. Reich sees this as a layer of basically, pent-up, aggressive, pathological expression of energy or misdirection of energy in a variety of ways. And Reich talks at various times, on a more theoretical basis of the impact of how this gets created through the alteration of the child's life, and thus Reich's incredible early interest and more persistent, aggressive interest in childhood and early childhood and really looking at and studying it. And Reich talks from a very early stage in his writing about the need, more than even Freud, of studying children and understanding how and what the function of childhood is. It's with John Bowlby, who I recently established, even though he never writes about Reich openly, worked very closely with A.S. Neal. And the crucial decision in John Bowlby's life to become a child psychiatrist was after spending a summer with A.S. Neal, Neal was an educator who was a very close associate of Reich. And Bowlby goes into this because he understands that the key is to understand what happens to the young child. And in one sense, attachment theory in Bowlby's work really explains to me how that secondary layer, that alteration takes place in the organism. And interestingly, in the standard psychoanalytic community, Bowlby was never and is still very uncomfortably accepted. Yeah, right. Even though they had to keep him there, and he was always the president of the psychoanalytic community in England because he was the only one that everybody liked and didn't have any axe to grind. He just did his work. But what Bowlby's work, to those of you who don't know it, on attachment theory, building of attachment model, really explains is how, not by some instinctive inheritance, but by the alterations that take place on the most subtle levels in the child from the time it's born, maybe before it's born, really produce this kind of layering, this kind of reconfiguration of natural function of the organism, which produces alterations that produce, although we never uses those words, the kinds of things that Reich is talking about when he talks about secondary layering or secondary, developmental characteristics. So that Reich can say that nobody is instinctively masochistic. We don't have an inborn masochism, an inborn desire to experience pain, guilt, shame, but that in fact that develops through a very, very subtle alteration dealing with the nature of the mother-child interaction, from the get-go, on levels that Reich was aware of, but that were that required years and years of people like Bowlby, Ainsworth, and finally Daniel Stern, to really say, look, there how in a 3-second interaction between that mother and child, you can begin to see the beginning of that alteration. And that's repeated 1 trillion times a day in some cases. And that's why you can't see it. And that's why and Reich was always very generous. That's why he understood at the end, in Reich Speaks on Freud, that Freud's errors had partly to do with his own character structure, his own alterations, his own limitations, but also because the stuff that they were trying to see, we just didn't have the means yet to observe. And even Reich didn't quite have the means. The one attempt he made to begin to set up a very, very broad-scale project to study children and how the mother interaction took place basically floundered on philosophical and personal limitations plus financial limitations, but at least set the stage. Bowlby and others, historically, for whatever reasons, because of the availability of resources, began to really look at that very, very minute interaction between mother and child, and a number of anthropologists along with them. The 50s is a watershed time for that, really produces a mass of information about how those kinds of subtle alterations take place and how they add up to a full-scale characterological armor and physical armor. And I think with those two pieces, you wind up with an incredibly strong argument that supports Bowlby's whole position, which was that the big problem for psychoanalysis and for most psychoanalysts is that they had not a clue how to do science. And they didn't have a clue how to really do careful, detailed, observation. Even Melanie Klein, who was closest, were just not scientifically, they were concerned more about speculative theory than they were about just building information. And I think as you get that, to me, it gives the key piece that that explains, I think that's a very, very important distinction between Freud's centrality of the unconscious and Reich's ideas about the nature of armoring and the secondary layer. So I think that was very, maybe we should throw it, I mean, unless you have some yeah.
A couple of questions related to those points. Dr. Lewis, one of the differences I think you're describing regarding this issue of the unconscious is that Reich viewed the organism as a physical organism. So it was almost topographical. If I'm not mistaken, the unconscious is a topographical feature, where Freud is viewing it as this human organism where there's an interplay between what's conscious and what's unconscious. Is that point clear? No.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think it's a fairly accurate statement. I'm not sure what the point is.
Okay, just trying to understand this.
Yeah.
Regarding the issue of using psychology as access, you spoke about that in the beginning. It's sort of a difficult thing. We're using psychology now to understand these ideas. Linguistic function, language function, memory, etc. Could you speak about the need for psychology to understand Reich, and also the difficulty of letting go of psychology to fully understand it?
Well, I think I think there are two issues. I mean, one is rather than not to understand Reich as much. To understand Reich, we can do a psychological, psychoanalytic investigation. But orgonomy, the issue is I don't think there are functional aspects of orgonomy, as I understand it, that are deeply rooted and use elements of psychological understanding. If one assumes that psychology incorporates cognitive functioning and emotional expression, certainly psychology, as Dr. Weitzman is saying, is quite real part of our organism. And Reich never negates that. The issue really is whether it's the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail. I take Reich's work and even Bowlby's work, and my own view is that psychology is the interpersonal experience and is the end product of a complex, organismic experience. In other words, you have a physical organism that has a particular potential. It becomes socially engaged, whether it's here or in Iraq or wherever, and the result is a complex process by which these experiences are organized, internalized, and narrated and understood. Historically, that becomes, for lack of or for simplest terms, your psychology, your psychological being, yourself, your individual. We can go into more elaborate discussions of exactly how that breaks down and what that is in terms of ego, superego, or other kinds of expressions or other systems of psychology. But clearly, we can use that to understand certain aspects of how Freud did this or how Reich did that, or what the individual goes through. But from an orgonomic perspective, it's only a particular part of the study that we might do, or the way we might look at the organism. It's not the primary defining moment. In other words, I think the difference for me has always been is that in psychoanalytic or psychodynamic psychology, whichever manifestation of it you take, it all comes out of really psychoanalysis anyways. The emphasis is, and Freud clearly actually politically worked to establish the fact that psychoanalysis would be preeminent. I mean, there is that important interchange in Freud's own letters and writings in which he said, we cannot allow the young doctors, the young analysts, to get involved in biology and the biological implications, because this will undermine the building of a psychology. So that even though Freud, Soloway quotes this in Freud, Biologist of the Mind, that even though Freud knew that the underlying reality of the human organism was basically biological, he pushed away because he didn't want psychoanalysis or his psychology to become a footnote to biology. And that he specifically makes a directive to all the other inner circle members that, and is in writing, that they are to crush and discourage any young people from pursuing a biological understanding of psychology. And that maybe later, at some future time, once he's established, the psychoanalysis has become established as its own independent science, we can allow more of that in. Which is interesting, because in some ways Reich does that, except in their view, too early, and therefore gets pushed out. But, I mean, Freud was aware, at least according to Sullivan, and to my reading, and of course I'm biased, he makes a very good argument for this. So, I'm not sure I'm answering what you're saying, but so to use psychology as a way of understanding orgonomy, if you mean by psychology our linguistic processes, our cognitive processes, yeah, of course we have to use that, but that's really an expression of our nature.
I guess part of the question I'm asking is, what makes it difficult to let go of psychology to understand it? Because or that's a very involved answer.
No, what makes it, I think what makes it difficult is our own structures, our own anxiety, our own fears, plus the last 100 and some odd years of being told that now, don't forget it was very difficult to let go of a lot of other stuff to accept psychology. I mean, there was a great deal of resistance to letting go of the other systems that existed before, Darwin and Freud came along. Now it's become part of our culture, so we resist. But clearly, I think, in line with what Dr. Weitzer was saying, is that Reich was attempting, successfully or unsuccessfully, I think he was successful in terms of what he finally put together as a broad model. It was unsuccessful in the fact that it didn't become the kind of broadly accepted paradigmatic, shift. Then Reich was proposing a model that was going to supplant what existed, what has existed.
One way that Reich expressed it was in terms of a hierarchy of the different sciences. And I think, as he correctly pointed out, any biological law which is valid applies also to psychology, but not vice versa.
Right.
The same thing with physics and biology.
Right.
I mean, biology can't violate a physical law,
Right.
but physics does not necessarily follow biological law. So there's a hierarchy of sciences. But I mean, the question of giving it up or not giving it up, I think it's a complicated question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's just a question of being so used to it now after 100 years of Freudian thinking, permeating our psyches and our cultures. I think there may be other difficulties involved. I mean, for one thing, there are. The fact is, language and thought are very important parts of our way of expressing how we feel and what we know, and a lot of energy movement takes place through words and through ideas. So we have to accept that as a biological fact. We also have to accept the fact that we have brains, and that these brains, are somewhat, the nervous system, is specialized to organize our energetic makeup in certain ways. So, we know that we have certain potentials, behavioral potentials, which will develop in one way or another, or maybe not develop at all.
Depending on any alterations. And the alterations aren't necessarily, there can be any number of ways that those things become altered. I think actually as you're talking, it's occurring to me, I think the real issue, I got waylaid. I think we're getting waylaid. The real issue isn't abandoning psychology. Reich isn't proposing abandoning psychology, or he's just saying that, exactly as Dr. White said.
Ideally, he'd want to understand it differently.
Right.
Put it in a larger context.
It's an expression of the organism's expression of energy. So in one sense, language, art, all these expressions are quite real, and for him, they were very real expressions. I mean, he was involved with the art. He loved playing music, art. But what he would say is that you don't need to explain that on some level by some complex psychological theory. You can explain it by the movement of it, exactly as Dr. White was saying.
One of my favorite passages in Reich is, I think, again in Cosmic Superimposition, where he tries to define thinking energetically, and the definition is very simple. Thinking is the energy reaching out and grasping something in the world.
Mhm.
I mean, something like that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly.
So, but I mean, that doesn't completely capture what thinking is, because thinking also has an abstract part. But I think again, you have to accept the fact that there's a fundamental problem built into all of this, which expresses itself as a fundamental disagreement between Freud and Reich. Because for Freud, things like language and ideas are in a sense hardwired and inherited, whereas for Reich they're more fluid, because he looks at it to begin with as energy functions.
Right.
One of Reich's, I think it's in the cancer biography that he makes a statement. It's the other way of approaching the question about. He approaches it quantitatively. He says he argues against using psychological methods in orgone therapy because the amount of energy that is contained in the human psychology is very small compared to the amount that's contained in bioenergetic functions in general, like muscular armoring and biopathic tendencies, however they are anchored in the organism. And so he makes that argument based on experience, empirically, that it's not worth working psychologically for that, because the amount of energy that you tap into is too small. It's not enough. And so the results aren't as good. If you present that argument to a psychoanalyst, the psychoanalyst has a counter-argument. And the counter-argument has to do with what psychoanalysts call object relations. One of the things that you have to give up when you do orgone therapy is working with transference. You don't have to give up working with object relations, because it's part of our development, is that we develop attachments. And that's why Bowlby was interested in attachments, because the attachment to the mother and to other early objects becomes very important in how the energy gets channeled and structured. But what happens? See, here's the counter argument. One of the counter arguments to Reich is that as soon as you establish a relationship with another person, irrational things start happening. You get reminded of other people in your life, and these reminiscences that you have occur on an unconscious level. That they have to do with very early experience. They have to do with the unconscious ideas and patterns and so forth. So there is an argument to be made that psychology re-enters the scene as soon as you explore the relation of the patient to the therapist. That in that relationship there are irrational feelings and irrational structures, which in addition to their energic components, also have structural components. Like it reminds you start reenacting irrational things from long ago.
But Reich would say that again, that the reason for that is not because psychology has done that, that's a psychological response to an early alteration in the ability of the organism to function energetically. And Bowlby would support Bowlby's work clearly supports that it happened, and Stern's work clearly supports it. It happens on such a early level. But one of the thoughts I'm having, and maybe we finish on this as this goes on, I mean, some of you are not involved in the intricacies of psychoanalysis versus orgonomy, as Dr. Weitz and I would, and his students, was that every time we began to talk about orgonomy as an independent, way of thinking, that we inevitably come back to, well, but what about psychoanalysis, and what about it?
It's not necessarily. I mean, you could see it as a challenge. You could see it as going back. I mean, this is true in all science, that the pioneers of the science don't bother with certain details. And one of the details that Reich didn't bother with was to go back and apply the concepts of orgonomic functionalism to cognitive functions to problems of the unconscious.
Yeah,
transference,
I
which he
think that's
abandoned
true.
years ago. So I think it's
No,
not
I think that's true.
necessarily
Yeah, right. No,
exclusive.
I think among one other things, Reich does say at various points when he was asked, there are a number of places where he's asked about, well, what do you think intelligence is, or what do you think intellectual activity is? And clearly he had a bias, and this had to think to do a lot with his own energetic function, which was tending to say, I mean, at various times he would say provocative things like, well, intelligence and intellect is probably a product of armoring, and it's probably just, individuals, trying to deal with their fear of their own natural pulsatory functions. And in some of us, that's probably true, or many of us, that's probably true.
But he liked listening to Beethoven.
Yeah, but on the other hand, he certainly was fully, it wasn't like he just basically, he wasn't like he was some sort of, hippie wandering out and deciding to have no, consciousness, or he wasn't interested in Buddhism as a way of escaping, sort of the bodily function and the bodily nature. So, but I think what I'm trying to say is that inevitably one of the problems is, and I think actually as I'm thinking, I think Dr. Weitz's point is true, is that it might be very, very productive for anyone interested in it to go back once one had a good handle on orgonomic functional thinking, to go back and actually look at psychology, or look at psychoanalysis, or object relations, or the varieties of psychoanalytic thinking or modern psychology, and really address those issues from an orgonomic perspective, rather than what tends to happen is for us to look at that's what I'm trying to say. The tendency is because orgonomy has become a much more sort of marginal, of marginal interest, historical interest. The tendency is to look at orgonomy from the perspective of modern psychology,
Yeah,
or modern
a good place to start
theory.
would be the effects of trauma.
Right.
It's so easy to define the psychological constellation of post-traumatic reactions,
Right.
and we know that it involves, from an energetic point of view, we know it involves some kind of contraction of the energy field or of the organism itself. So that would be a place to start for anyone who's interested in making those connections.
Matt Becker just got this. This is how ideas for future topics. We'll do an orgonomic approach to post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress now has become the new, the popular. I mean, and I'm not making light of it, but it would be very valuable to look at things like post-traumatic stress and from an orgonomic perspective. But I think clearly there's value, and I think that's what Reich was also trying to say, is that stop thinking about how psychoanalysis or how psychology defines or affects or translates into orgonomy. Use orgonomy to look at these phenomena. And I think that's the struggle, that very often when most of us come to this, we come to it, if we're at all interested in this and have any background, we look at how does this relate to psychoanalysis, how does psychoanalysis become orgonomy, rather than say, we have this orgonomic knowledge, how do we understand a lot of other things historically and interpersonally?
Reich was obviously going in the cosmic direction. He was looking for common functioning principles that were broader and broader. But there's no reason why you can't look for common functioning principles right under your nose. You don't have to necessarily, go out with your telescope.
In great, and I say this with great admiration, Dr. Weitzner, who, having trained orgonomically, went more fully back into the psychoanalytic community and remained in that community, someone who speaks very, very eloquently from Reich's work and uses Reich's work to look at what he does. My sense is that most of his colleagues, the more orthodox analytic community, tend to see him as a little bit, they sort of accept him as odd,
Actually, there are two of us.
There are two. I don't know who's the other couple.
My friend Koblenz.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I should introduce.
But again, I mean, I think there is a broad, way of approaching that, and I think certainly to the extent that orgonomy remains a very, very sort of embattled and smaller and smaller. I was thinking of myself as, or of us as sort of Last of the Jedi warriors type of, thing where you have this sort of body of knowledge and it becomes more and more, restricted. But I think there's a tendency to try to place ourselves in the context of these more successful, more prevalent, larger movements, rather than come to these movements and say we're dealing with this material also, but this is our way of dealing with it, our way of understanding it. Okay. But let me just quickly, we started a little bit late, let's throw it out more than just these, this was, in my impulse was to also just sort of do a general presentation and to raise issues that might affect people on a more general level rather than the specifics or technical level. So wondering, there are 10 of you or so sitting here, what questions or thoughts about orgonomy would bring you to, or in a sense, what you didn't get from this presentation that you were hoping to get, or answer, issues raised that weren't really addressed, give you a chance to question, or nothing. Everything you wanted to desire was answered.
Hi, I came here because I'm interested in energy and energy work, and I think that personally I feel that fear has energy as well. Emotions carry energy with them. And did he ever talk about that? And is there an anti-energy that, or is there just a lack of energy that creates illness and
well, I don't think it's a
pain?
lack of it. I think, again, it's all energetic function, and fear, certainly in our understanding, and coming from Reich, fear is really an expression of some alteration or some interference with an animal becomes afraid when in some way its free natural movement is restricted or threatened, or a restriction or an adjustment has to be made. And if that adjustment is harsh enough or threatening enough, it responds by essentially contracting, recoiling, and then figuring out how it's going to get moving again. So that the classic would be, you step on a dog is quite relaxed. You step on his tail, or you kick it by accident, it gets frightened, it contracts, it pulls back, it tenses, it gets ready to act either aggressively. If you calm it and it's healthy enough, it relaxes. So fear is a natural product, is a secondary response to a challenge to the natural energetic flow. Okay, so that the danger would be to see fear, just as the danger would be to see post-traumatic stress as the prime mover rather than a reaction to conditions that produce it. So the fear is something that's produced by some, certainly in my understanding of Reich's work, fear is produced by a reaction to some alteration in the environment that threatens the organism. Many times it's rational. If it becomes persistent, or if one finds oneself being chronically afraid, then that alteration has become pathological and it's become anchored in the organism, and we would probably, in most cases, call it some sort of anxiety disorder. Anxiety, without a specific situational, circumstance, it is a pathology. Is the result of a chronic alteration in the organism in some way. So energy, again, is really not something. Energy is there whether we're calling it orgonomy or whatever. Energy is energy. It just simply is, and it functions, and it pulsates, and it does what it does. Orgonomy, I think, what appeals to me in orgonomic work is that it's an attempt to understand how energy functions naturally, and then also what happens when there are variations as a result of alterations in energetic function. And certainly in doing treatment, one has to be aware that the goal is to get the organism to be able to tolerate natural movement of energy as much as it can without precipitating situations that are so frightening and so fearful that the organism recoils and cannot move ahead. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's certainly.
I would add one thing, that there's also, I mean, Reich, of course, did view emotions as movement of energy. And he did, I think he had some, to a certain extent, a theoretical way of explaining why emotions were sometimes not felt. And which had to do, I think, partly with the idea of freezing of energy when it becomes structuralized, where you have energy opposing itself and then it becomes frozen.
Right.
And the idea of contactlessness.
Stasis, basically stasis.
Right. So it becomes no longer felt.
Right.
Freud struggled with the idea of unconscious feeling or affect, because it didn't make sense psychologically. You could have a feeling and not know it. But in fact, it happens. And Reich's explanation, energetically, was that the energy gets frozen because it's.
That's why if we can free it up, and often that can be that's easier said than done, and that even if you do free it up and you break through the stasis, what you're going to encounter are emotions that, and anyone who's been in treatment knows, you're going to encounter emotions that often can't be easily explained, or in some cases can't be easily tolerated. So that the organism's inevitable response is to try to do what it's always done, which is freeze it up again.
Right, the paradigm would be in an obsessional kind of character, where you have, because of neurotic development, you have a fear of expansion. And so whenever the organism expands, it tends to contract, and that creates anxiety. And so the obsessional character develops a kind of a rigid balance between the two. So it's frozen. You don't feel anything. But I mean, that's the paradigm.
Everyone else around you feels the obsessional impact, but you don't. But that's because and that's Reich is very good on that. Very important to remember. Reich always reminds his students, and when he talks about this stuff, and when he writes about this, is that these things are not to be taken lightly because they work. So it's easy to say, oh, it's just a matter of that people create stasis and blah, blah, blah. But the reason it's so hard to alter that is because, for better or worse, these alterations have been effective. It's only that they also have fallout in a variety of ways that create additional and complex range of problems that we have to interfere. I remember Dr. Solberg once very, very wise, he pointed out, I think actually it was in my own treatment, I was complaining about, I was complaining how I used to do something in a particular way, and why can't I do it that way anymore? He said, because if it continued to work, you never would have come here. It never would have been a problem. It might have been a problem when you're 65 and having a heart condition or something like that. But what happens is we usually wind up in treatment because some system that we've developed is no longer working. Otherwise, for better or worse, it's what you got. So I think this is very, very important to understand that these are not, and certainly from Reich's perspective, these were not just casual events. That these were very, very definite patterns. I think Reich himself was hoping that you could get to a point where you could really, if Reich became limited in one sense, was that there was a constant hope he could find some way of avoiding transference, avoiding issues of and just get it so it could be worked on directly, and you resolve that, stasis, or resolve that thing, and it'll all sort of shift around and get right again. But in fact, I think towards the end of his life, part of his pessimism, not so much pessimism, part of his sense of defeat towards the end was that you get this sense of overwhelming understanding that so much deeper than I anticipated. In the middle and early writings, not only with a whole generation, there's this, even through the Second World War, there's this sense in the letters of many of these guys, not just Reich, Neil, but also almost all of the intellectuals, writers, artists. I've often talked about this incredible enthusiasm through the 30s and 40s and 50s of how we're onto it. We really, the reason that Freud's work was so attractive to so many people was that it gave the people a sense that we're getting the answers, and it's not that far from solution. And I think there was this incredible period in the 50s particularly, and I think that's part of what also impacts on Reich's demise and end, was this sudden sense, you can see it in so many writers, not just Reich, a variety of writers, this sense of gee, it's much, much, much more profoundly problematic than we ever thought. And that it might take this, Reich remains optimistic to the end. He believes that 500 years from now, it'll finally, if we don't destroy ourselves, it will be resolved and it will be, we will progress. But for many, there's this sense of, just defeat, that it's not going to, but in the 40s, even during the Second World War, especially as the Second World War wound down and the feeling of victory, there was a sense that the new world was going to emerge almost momentarily, if not already. And that had to do also with the vision that atomic energy and space and all these things were going to really bring it to us, and I think so. And then when that crashed, and when people began to realize it wasn't going to happen, there was a profound sense of pessimism, and many of them just gave up, defeated. So unless, I don't know if that answers, the danger of asking questions of a broad nature. Any other questions to end on?
I would just, as we're talking about the movie, I was thinking about, you mentioned it, I would have liked to have heard about the experimentation itself and the discovery of the Orgone energy, and in the process to kind of learn how to distinguish better the Orgone energy from other kind of energies.
Well, I think that's a subject for another. What really needs to be done is a laboratory. We need to have. What part of this is the existence of the limitations on our economic and time constraints. Part of it is to set up a laboratory and have someone who can really do that more fully than I certainly could, to demonstrate, to give demonstrations, and then also to people who are more. I'm not a natural scientist. I'm certainly not. My physics and my my biological knowledge is pretty strong. But we need people. There are individuals who understand the full. I could give a general account of what nature of other energetic expressions are in relationship to orgonomic energy, Orgone energy. But again, that it would be a subject for, and we have done that. We attempted to do that a couple of times with some interesting results. But part of it is the limitations on our physical capability. So what I recommend to people who really want to do that is to get a microscope, and many of the experiments that Reich did are replicable on a fairly simple home-grown basis. They're not. We did it at our offices when we had a larger office, and that can be done. The main part is you have to get some good, lab equipment and know how to do it. It's not always so. For guys like Dr. Weitzner and Dr. Schwartz, who used to, share our office, Dr. Schwartz did it up. He snuck in and used. When he was doing his pre-med, he snuck in and used the laboratories up at Columbia to set up experiments and run them and take pictures. And Orgonon, the Reich Museum, the Old Reich Estate, does do gives at times presentations, and the American College of Orgonomy, who I'm not affiliated with, we're not affiliated with, and that's another topic, does do occasionally lab presentations, in which they show the actual work. And I strongly recommend that anybody who's interested in this work not approach it on the basis of a belief that what Dr. Lewis says or Dr. Whiteman says or Dr. Reich says is true, that you actually go and look at the science of it. But you don't have to. You can also just live your lives and use it as you need.
I just want to ask if I'm walking out with a misconception from having been here this morning, that the memories involved in the armoring are not as important as I thought they were, that the actual overall functioning, the ability for the pulsating to be worked on, does not really associate as much with. I always thought for every release there had to be a memory that came with that.
Sometimes a memory, I had someone yesterday just suddenly got incredibly rageful, right? But throughout the whole experience, he was smiling. He was, you know, and I said, well, were there any thoughts? And he said, no. I said, I don't know, it doesn't connect to anything. I said, so how did you feel about it? I said, oh, I felt great doing it. It was a pleasure. And it reminded me of seeing kids who sometimes just, I used to, there was a kid when my daughter was very young, used to watch in the park, every once in a while would just go wild in the park and run through the sandbox and just throw, not saying that other kids, he wasn't really being aggressive, he was just sort of rolling around and just letting go and enjoying it. And so, you know, again, there doesn't always have to be a specific memory or a specific, you know, insight. What Reich says is that usually when you break through, very often memories spontaneously occur. Those memories are don't get the misconception would be to think that those personal memories aren't important. They are. They're important for you, and to understand them and to gain some insight, to gain some feeling, you know. Or sense of how to deal with those experiences are wonderful on a personal level. But in terms of the broader issues that we were talking about, it's about energetic function, so that if you can begin to function more fully, whatever your memories are, and not be haunted by those memories, and not be held by those memories, that's the success.
But those memories did not cause the dysfunction.
No. Those events that those memories are connected to, or the result of many of which aren't exactly the real things that happen anyways, but they're connected to them, or at least as you perceive them the way they happen, are what caused the alteration in your structure. But resolving the memories or breaking through to the memories aren't going to, at least in orgonomic terms, psychoanalytically they might, but
I think in Reich's early writing, he emphasized the spontaneous recovery of memory because he was still thinking as a psychoanalyst. But I think his final position was that these things work themselves out sometimes much later,
right,
not necessarily at the time of the breakthrough.
Right, and that the more important is then to go out and as you get freer and more capable pulsing to engage in life.
And interestingly enough, the psychoanalysis as a field has moved away from the simple-minded idea of recovery of unconscious memories to a more sophisticated view that the memories are composites of one's total experience and represent aspects of one's emotional structure. And what's really important is what happens in the here and now,
right,
in the way one functions and relations with people and so forth. So memories don't necessarily come out right away.
I have a question for Dr. Weiser. You mentioned that the transference is not used in orgone therapy. Is that necessarily so, and is it also so with the countertransference and in character analysis?
It's a very interesting question. A teacher of mine...
Because I was surprised that you said that.
A teacher of mine, Joel Covell, told me one. He had been in orgone therapy himself and loved Reich mostly for his politics, but also because of his whole work. And he told me that he had left orgone therapy and decided to become a psychoanalyst for precisely this reason, because he felt that orgone therapy didn't work with transference. I would say that is true to a large extent, but I would have to qualify it. I would have to say that in orgone therapy, one is aware that the transference exists. One is aware that the feelings that come out, whether they're in the direction of the therapist or anybody else, that those feelings reflect the armoring and the energy movement. So one is aware of it. What I think is also true is that one does not have a specific technique for dealing with it.
Right.
That one deals with it the way one deals with everything else in orgone therapy, by trying to break through armor and reestablish pulsation. You might confront it if you thought it was useful,
right,
but one doesn't interpret it. In other words, one doesn't do what a Freudian analyst does, which is to interpret the different aspects of the transference and to relate it to prior experience and so forth. So one doesn't have a systematic way of dealing with it.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that you're avoiding it.
No, you don't avoid it at all. But certainly,
But in character analysis, you might use
In character analysis, you would deal with it quite systematically.
But certainly in Reich's terms, and this is crucial, Reich felt that the transference was a thing that interfered with getting on to really resolving, the blocks.
Yeah, whereas Freud felt it was a golden road
right.
to cure.
And so for Reich, that meant constantly looking for ways or hoping that he would be able to find ways to, but also part of it was personal, is that he felt that the transference issues and counter-transference issues just exhausted him. And it does. Anyone who does this kind of work knows that it's exhausting. And anyone who has interpersonal relationships knows. It's not just in therapy. Transference and interpersonal, it's exhausting. So for Reich, there was a hope that there could be some way of getting past that so that that didn't prevent the work from going on. And I think the last attempt was in the development of these various accumulator devices, the shooter, the doorbuster, which I and Dr. Weitzner have both used effectively, and it does get results. The problem is, as Dr. Sobey said, and Dr. Reich found, is that you got results, but it wasn't always so easy to control the transference once you got those results. Because ultimately, and we'll end it on that because it's getting, is the transference, from an ergonomic perspective, is an expression of the organism's in behavioral attempt to make sense or to, basically resolve imbalance. And so that thinking, as Reich did, or as we did, that we could stir things up, it will basically break through. But once you break through, the organism, just as it's going to physically attempt to defend itself, is going to behaviorally attempt to defend itself, and it's going to behaviorally attempt to defend itself in very much the way it did when it was a baby or a child, or when these patterns began to develop, and therefore there you are dealing with transference. So if I'm threatening a patient's stability, she or he is going to respond to me in very, very much the way characteristically they always have. Now the difference is in psychoanalytic or character analytic work, we would interpret that and help the person understand that pattern. Ergonomically, what we would do is say, is understand that that's happening and say, it's okay, let's just keep pushing through and get you to tolerate more of that experience so it doesn't become disruptive. The problem with that is that many patients, if you do it too fast, the biggest mistake in most, in many less experienced, in quote, Reichian approaches is you break through, you get people, going, and then they can't tolerate it, and it collapses back. If you do it, as Reich points, slowly and carefully, you get the individual to be able to tolerate it a little more, incorporate it, and then move on, to the next step, and that's where we'll end. Thanks, Dr. Weitzler. Thank David Silver for letting us use his loft. The next lecture in May, if you're interested, we'll actually still pick up on this, and we'll get a chance, hopefully, to hear what Reich has to say about some of these same subjects in his own voice, in his own words. Those of you who owe me money, pay me money. It's $15 if you're not a student. If you're a bona fide student with an ID, you can.
Is there a combo deal for the other?
Yeah, if you pay for both, it's what did I say? What does it say on the?
I think it's 25 for both.
It's 25 for both rather than 30.